we're going to cover the peripheral nervous system. But first of all, just a reminder of the various divisions of the nervous system. Remembering our central nervous system, which is our brain and our spinal cord, is always talking with our peripheral nervous system, which is our cranial nerves and spinal nerves. And we receive sensory information, so through the afferent division. That can be somatic, so those are our somatic senses or our general senses. They're things like touch, pain, pressure, vibration, temperature, proprioception, which is where are our joints in space, and also with our special senses, such as hearing, equilibrium, vision, and smell. Then we have our visceral sensory system, such as stretch, pain, temperature, and special senses such as taste. Now, all those afferent senses are coming in. They're coming in through our peripheral nerves, whether that's cranial or spinal. They get processed in the central nervous system, whether that's a reflex, for example, a spinal reflex, or whether it's up at the level of the brain and the brain stem. And then the motor information comes out, which is through our efferent division, to control our somatic senses, so that's our skeletal muscles, or our visceral motor, such as our sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. It's also called our autonomic nervous system. And what we're going to be focusing on in this early stage is we're just going to look at that sensory or the afferent division of the nervous system. So what is the purpose of our peripheral sensory receptors? Well, of course, it's to detect stimuli and give that information to our central nervous system so it can respond accordingly. So we can want to respond to changes in our internal and external environment. And if we activate a receptor, whatever type of receptor that is, you generate a graded potential. And if that graded potential is strong enough, you then go on to generate an action potential, which, as you will know, is an all or nothing event. Whereas a graded potential may reach threshold or it may not reach threshold to generate an action potential. That information travels along our afferent peripheral nervous system fibers to our central nervous system, where it can be processed. So the sensation of a stimulus is the awareness of the stimulus, and the perception of a stimulus is that interpretation of the meaning of that stimulus. So when we talk about our general senses, because we sometimes talk about our general senses and our special senses, our general senses are used to describe our sensitivity to things like temperature, pain, touch, pressure, vibration, and proprioceptions. And then, of course, our special senses are smell, vision, taste, balance, and hearing. And these receptors tend to be more complex than those of the general senses. So when we're thinking about sensation and perception, they generally occur in the central nervous system. And so now we have our different types of receptors. We have mechanoreceptors, thermoreceptors, photo, chemo, and nociceptors. So as usual, I'd like you to press pause at this point and just think about what is the type of stimulus that will stimulate your mechanoreceptor or your thermoreceptor, and try and be quite specific in what you say. Okay, so our mechanoreceptors, they respond to mechanical force, such as touch, pressure, vibration, or stretch. And an example of that would be including changes to blood pressure. So our baroreceptors is an easy one, or vibration within the skin, or touch or pressure within the skin, or stretch within the stomach. So there are lots of different types of mechanoreceptors. We have thermoreceptors. They respond to temperature changes, not to the actual temperature, but to a temperature change. So you just need to think about if you put your hand in some really cold, icy water, which is very, very cold, and then you move it into just some lukewarm water that would usually just feel lukewarm and not particularly unpleasant. You take your hand taken out of very, very cold, icy water and plunge it into some lukewarm water, and it will feel very, very hot. And that's because your thermoreceptors respond to changes in temperature, not the absolute temperature itself. We have photoreceptors, which respond to light energy, and that, your example there is obviously your photoreceptors within the retina. Your chemoreceptors respond to chemicals, so molecules smelled, tasted in the blood or interstitial fluid. And when they respond, these receptors respond to chemicals, remember that they have to be dissolved in solution. If they're not dissolved in solution, your chemoreceptors can't respond. And then you have your nociceptors. They respond to pain, so such as searing heat, extreme cold, excessive pressure. They also include things like your inflammatory chemicals. So all of these signals stimulate subtypes of thermoreceptors, mechanoreceptors, and chemical receptors or chemoreceptors. So our receptors do have specificity. For example, a touch receptor is sensitive to pressure, but not to a dissolved stimulus. And that's because of their differing receptor structures. And like I said, there are separate receptors for pressure, for temperature, for chemicals, whatever it might be. And they can have very high sensitivity. For example, our olfactory receptors, those are involved in smell, can respond to just a few odor molecules in the air. Your visual receptors can respond to single photons, so that sensitivity can be very, very high. And if we're thinking about what is the minimum stimulus for each of these different types of stimulus, vision, on a clear night, a candle flame can be seen at how many kilometers? Hearing, when quiet, the tick of a clock. What about that? How many meters can you hear that away? 1 teaspoon of sugar can be tasted in how many liters of water? 1 drop of perfume diffused in the volume of how many rooms? Okay, I want you to just have a think and just think, what are those distances, or what is that volume? What do you think your senses, that minimum stimulus is? Just to put it in context, for touch, the wing of a fly falling on your cheek can be detected from 1 centimeter. So you can feel that just about touching your skin. So, vision, on a clear night, a candle flame can be seen at 45 kilometers, quite a long way. When quiet, the tick of a clock can be heard at 7 meters. But of course that does depend how loud the clock is, I guess. Taste, 1 teaspoon of sugar in how many liters of water? 10 liters. So very, very dilute, but you can still just about taste it. Smell, 1 drop of perfume diffused in the volume of 6 rooms. So you can still smell that when it's diffused throughout those entire 6 rooms. So again, starting to put into context how little stimulus you need to actually be able to respond to that stimulus, whatever it might be. So what are the simplest? So our receptors, they can be quite complex. Like we've said in the special senses, they can be very complex. But the simplest ones are really just dendrites of our sensory neurons. And so these are called free nerve endings, and they extend throughout a tissue. And they can be stimulated by lots of different things. And so therefore we'll have a receptive field. And that's the area monitored by a single receptor cell. So if we have a look at these 2 neurons, they're little dendrites, sensory dendrites coming out. Here's your receptive field of the first one, and here is your receptive field of the second. Let's call it a nociceptor for sake of argument, but it could be a touch receptor, it could be anything. And so the larger the receptive field, the poorer your ability to localize a stimulus. For example, some of the touch receptors on the skin have a receptive field of about 7 centimeters. So you can only describe a light touch as affecting a general area. So if you think about it, the area on your back, for example, it has a very large receptive field for some of these receptors. Whereas in contrast, the tongue and the fingertips, those receptive areas, are less than a millimeter, so you can be very precise about the location. But what are the types of sensory receptors? We've talked about the free nerve endings. So these are primarily involved in pain and temperature. You've got the Merkel discs. You can see those. They're involved in light touch. So you can see they're very near the surface of the skin because they have to be, because it's about light touch. Whereas the free nerve endings with pain and temperature are at the surface, but also can be deeper down. You have the root hair complexes, which is shown within this area. And so they entwine their hair follicles. And again, they're involved with light touch. So movement of those hairs will allow that light touch to be detected. You've got the Meissner corpuscles, so which again, near the surface, so to do with touch and light pressure in hairless skin areas. So you've got the hairy areas, the root hair plexus, and the Meissner's corpuscles in the hairless regions of skin. You've got the Ruffini's corpuscle. So again, looking at the location, they're a little bit deeper. So it's more to do with deep pressure and to do with stretch. And your Pacinian corpuscle, again, look quite deep down. So they're deeper skins, they're to do with deep pressure, again, with vibration. And when you're talking about your visceral system, to do with pain and nausea, hunger and fullness. So viscera, remember, is your internal organs. So proprioceptors, well, what are they? The proprioceptors are involved in many of our daily activities, such as walking, buttoning the shirt, typing and cycling. And they're all about the position in space, where your joints are, where your entire body is, really. And they're monitoring the degree of stretch and contraction within multiple systems, therefore getting information on body movements, such as helping to maintain balance and coordination. And this proprioceptive information is sent up to the cerebrum. So you have conscious aware, without looking where your joints are, you can close your eyes and you can go, oh, my feet is positioned at this angle, my arms are over here. So you know the cerebrum is telling you where the proprioceptive information is being sent to the cerebrum, so you know where your joints are. It's being sent to the cerebellum, because if your cerebellum is involved in smooth muscle contractions and movement from one place to another, or lifting up a glass, or whatever it might be. So your cerebellum needs to know where your joints are, to be able to tell them where to move to pick up that glass of water, or walk over a puddle, or whatever it might be. And it also goes to your spinal reflex arcs. Okay, so you have those spinal reflexes. So what are the types you have? Well, you have your joint kinesthetic receptors. These are present in your synovial joints, and they provide information on joint position and joint motion. You have your muscle spindles. These detect muscle length. And you have your Golgi tendon organs. And these are stimulated with excessive tension during muscle shortening, leading to relaxation of muscle. In other words, through motor neuron inhibition. And the Golgi organ tendons, they obviously function to protect muscle and connective tissue from injury. So these things have different functions. And our sensory receptors, they're also able to adapt, or some of them at least are able to adapt. And adaptation is just a change in sensitivity. In other words, a change in the frequency of nerve impulse generation in the presence of a constant stimulus. And so therefore, information about the stimulus, its strength, duration and pattern is encoded in the frequency of nerve impulses. So therefore that changes. And many, but not all receptors exhibit adaptation, which is a change in sensitivity and therefore nerve impulse generation. And so in time, the receptor membranes become less responsive to that continual constant stimulus, and therefore the graded potentials start to decline in frequency or stop altogether. And there are different types. You have your phasic or your fast adapting receptors. These give bursts of impulse at the beginning and at the end of a stimulus. So if you're looking at this little stimulus strength, you can see stimulus on, and we get a receptor potential, so strong graded potential. Stimulus remains in place, but the graded potential has basically disappeared. Then the stimulus goes off, and you get the off response. So you can see that's your fast adapting receptor. An example of your phasic receptors are things like pressure, touch, and smell. You then have your tonic receptors, which adapt slowly or not at all. In other words, they're allowing you to have a sustained response. So again, your stimulus comes on, and you get your graded potential, potentially leading to action potentials. Stimulus stays there, and so does you still get a receptor potential, as it's called. So you're still getting graded potential sufficient to generate those action potentials. Stimulus disappears, and of course, the receptor potential also disappears. So examples of tonic receptors are things like nociceptors, so pain. That pain is always there, it doesn't just dissipate slowly but surely. And most proprioceptors, because you need to know where your joints are in space all the time. And the reason for that is that this information is important for protection, because pain is a sign of potential damage going on. So it's your body's way of saying there's some damage happening here. So it wants to keep reminding you that there's some damage going on or potentially about to happen. And thinking about pain, that's what we're going to cover now. So of course, the storage of painful experiences in the memory helps us avoid potentially harmful events in the future. So pain is a very important concept. And as I said, it's very important for allowing us to know when our body is potentially undergoing damage. So sensation of pain is accompanied by motivated behavioral responses and emotional reactions. So your motivated responses may be things like withdrawal or defense, and your emotional responses might include things like crying and the fear that you may get because of those emotions. And subjective perception can be influenced by other past or present experiences. For example, a dentist visit. And subjective perception can include things like the heightened pain perception accompanying the fear of the dentist. So you basically go into the dentist and you're already in fear of what's going to happen. Or you may get a lowered pain perception in an injured athlete during a competitive event, for example. So these emotional memories are stored within the limbic system, which is our emotional center. And as I've said, pain is primarily a protective mechanism, and it's bringing to us a conscious awareness that tissue damage is occurring or is about to occur very soon. And the different types of pain are shown down on the left side of this table. So nociceptive, neuropathic, acute, chronic. And then I want you to think about pain threshold and pain tolerance. So what I'd like you to do is just in each case, press pause again, and just think, give me a description of what nociceptive pain is, neuropathic pain, acute and chronic, and then what pain threshold and pain tolerance actually mean. Because remember, pain receptors can be activated by many things. For example, chemicals released from injured tissue, too much pressure, for example. So press pause and have a think. Okay, so nociceptive pain is peripheral pain receptor stimulation, which is then transferred to the central nervous system, so we have conscious awareness of it. Neuropathic pain is due to abnormal nerve pathways or functions. So something's gone wrong with the nervous system. So when you hear about neuropathic pain, that's what it's referring to. Acute pain is obviously the nociceptive response to tissue damage in the acute phase. And chronic pain is obviously pain that lasts over an extended period, generally more than 12 weeks. Pain threshold is the point at which stimulus becomes painful. And everyone has a different pain threshold for the same stimulus. And pain tolerance is the degree to which stimulation can be endured. So we've now gone on to the different types of nociceptor classification by stimulus type. So if we're looking at the nociceptor types, we have mechanical, we have thermal, and we have polymodal. And again, this should be nice and easy just from their very name. So mechanical nociceptors is obviously due to mechanical damage. That might be things like cutting, crushing, and pinching. Your thermal is down to temperature extremes, particularly heat. And polymodal is where you may respond equally to all damaging stimuli. So polymodal nociceptors are often activated by chemicals from damaged tissues, for example. And so therefore, but they're basically adapted chemoreceptors in a lot of ways. And so when you get stimulation of the pain receptor of the nociceptor, the activation results in a graded potential. If the stimulus is strong enough, you get action potentials. It travels along the afferent peripheral nervous system fibers. So if it's happening in your hand, it's traveling along these afferent peripheral nervous system fibers to the central nervous system, where you may get a spinal reflex, for example, to lift your hand away from a hot object, as an example. Or it'll cross over, move up to your brain, where you get the conscious awareness of the pain. So when you start to get pain damage, you're damaging cells, and those cells start to release chemicals. And the presence of prostaglandins, which is one of those chemicals, greatly enhances the receptor response to noxious, nasty stimuli. And like I said, tissue injury leads to that local release of these prostaglandins from your damaged tissue. And your prostaglandins, really, they're just fatty acid derivatives that are derived from the plasma membrane of your cells that act locally upon being cleaved from that lipid bilayer due to that localized tissue injury. The prostaglandins act on receptor nerve endings, and they lower the nociceptor threshold for activation. In other words, it makes it easier to stimulate pain. A great example of this would be sunburn. So if you get yourself sunburnt, you've damaged lots of your skin cells, you're releasing lots of prostaglandins, that's lowered the nociceptor threshold for activation. So you'll find that area of skin that's sunburnt, you might just only have to touch it gently, and it's stimulating pain, even though normally touching your skin gently wouldn't stimulate pain. And that's due to the presence of these prostaglandins. And so what happens with the prostaglandins? Basically, this molecule in your plasma membrane, arachidonic acid, is broken down into your various prostaglandins and thromboxane, and it's done through these COX enzymes, the cyclooxygenase enzymes. And there are multiple drugs that inhibit these enzymes and therefore inhibit prostaglandins, and at the same time as lowering the pain threshold, they also reduce inflammation. And aspirin is a great example of this. It inhibits these COX enzymes, therefore inhibiting the synthesis of these prostaglandins, which contributes to its analgesic effect. Of course, analgesia is just reduced pain perception in the presence of that same stimulus that would normally generate pain. So we've gone a little bit through pain here, and what I'd like you to do is press pause, as usual, and complete the following table. So what's the nociceptor type that leads to fast pain and slow pain? Okay. What's the sensation type? Is it easy to localize? And does it occur first or does it occur second? So nociceptor type for your fast pain, that's mechanical and thermal. For the slow pain is polymodal when you get that chemical release. Sensation type, sharp and prickling. Slow pain, dull, aching, burning. Is it easy to localize? That fast pain, yes it is. The slow pain, due to the release of those prostaglandins, stimulation of those polymodal nociceptors, leaving that dull, aching, burning pain, it's quite hard to localize. It feels a bit more diffuse. Does it occur first or second? Well, obviously, fast pain occurs first, slow pain occurs second, persists for longer, and is generally more unpleasant because it's just there paining you away, so to speak.